Hello, I'm Chris Hartwell, and welcome to The Heartbeat. Today we're going to be talking about episode 4 of season 6 of HBO's Game of Thrones. Join me, won't you? Yes, this episode was such a breath of fresh air, not only because it succeeded, in my opinion anyways, in a lot of ways that last week's Oathbreaker failed, but because it meant I could cease to be that guy, someone who's constantly griping about a show and whining how it's no longer all that it used to be. And though there were certain elements from this week's episode that weren't perfect for me, by and large it did pack an emotional punch, and do so with some real visual grandeur and flair. And straight away, it was so nice to be wrong, and so un-Game of Thrones feeling to have something as narratively neat as Jon and Sansa meeting up at Castle Black at the very top of this episode. What? A character plans something and then 3 episodes later it happily comes to pass? What is this show? But even as it did uncharacteristically in some ways feel different as to what's come before on Game of Thrones, that in no way meant that this reunion felt cheap or easy, and even as it did lead to a momentary dip into one of my biggest pet peeves, that being having characters on a long-running television show kind of unnecessarily reminisce about past seasons. The moment did quickly segue into showing that the bringing together of these two characters also meant bringing together their contrary thoughts and desires, which is just what good drama is made of. It's yes, and yes, we're going to get this long-awaited reunion, and that means that Jon and Sansa will be stretched and pushed because of it. And by contrast, and it is a very subtle difference, but the scene between Brienne, Davos, and Melisandre was a great example of a fun reunion that really did nothing to move the plot forwards. Yes, we got to see these characters who for a long time, without even knowing it, were on opposite sides of a war finally stand together, but that's it. Of course, thinking about what they might do together going forwards is exciting, but that scene in and of itself didn't really give us any of that yet. Another really beautiful thing about that reunion scene was just the music, especially in an age where the modern blockbuster avoids identifiable recurring themes like the plague. Ramin Djawadi's Game of Thrones score stands as a testament to their power. To have a scene like Jon and Sansa's reunion, where not a word of dialogue was spoken, still carry so much weight, was due in large part to the sweeping King of the North Stark theme, a melody that conjured up so many other moments from the show's past, tying them to this new moment in a really rewardingly powerful way. I mean, just imagine if in the first Iron Man, that Stark was given a memorable theme, one which was then coupled with his numerous struggles and triumphs, and then imagine that theme being mashed together with Alan Silvestri's theme from Captain America: The First Avenger during Stark and Rogers' climactic battle at the end of Civil War, and just all the extra images and feelings that would have been conjured up and harkened back to. Something else that was extremely rewarding on this episode, especially when it came to Jon and Sansa's storyline, was just how their scenes didn't feel like one or two throwaway scenes only there to remind us of the existence of that storyline. No, it actually felt like a self-contained storyline comprised of a beginning, middle, and end, and was relatively satisfying because of that. Now, I'm not going to right now delve into the usage of the pink letter in this episode as compared to its usage in the book, especially considering how different the landscape of the show is, which really does eliminate much of the mystery of its origin, authorship, and purpose. But I will say, all things considering, I thought it was used pretty well on the show, because yes, it contained passages that conveniently riled up the wildlings and united them with our heroes, but more importantly, it gave Sansa an opportunity to, with authority and experience that Jon lacked, corroborate with what that letter said, and push Jon not only to understand that Ramsay's threats weren't idle, but that he had to act, and act now. Which again was just so helpful in making that reunion feel purposeful and important versus just happy fun times fan service. To go back to the pink letter for a moment though, now that its author has been all but confirmed, I have to wonder, why was it sent at all? Why antagonize Jon? Does Ramsay really want Sansa back? Does he really believe that having her as his queen will unify the North? Or is he just wanting to tie up loose ends, eliminating anyone that does or could one day oppose him? And as enjoyable as that forward movement was for Jon and Sansa, what was even more satisfying on this episode was watching the writers successfully endeavor to pace things out to ensure that they didn't feel rushed, and to take the time to stop and to breathe and remind us, for example, what it meant that Jon and Sansa were in the same room together, and how long it had been since that had happened, and how much they had grown on their own separate journeys. And to do so in these simple cinematic ways, like the look on Jon's face when Sansa asked him for a drink, or when Tollett apologized for the quality of the food and Sansa simply replied, "That's all right, there are more important things." The way the storyline continues to develop is also really interesting for Jon, just because for so long he's never really felt like a Stark, like he's part of that family unit, if only because for most of this series he's been bodily apart from them, fighting his own battles. So bringing him back in contact with Sansa, and hopefully Rheon soon as well, does make him feel a bit more like their brother, and will allow the theoretical revelation that he's not to carry just a little more weight and potential tragedy. Speaking of weight and tragedy, though there was a severe lack of either of those with Osha's death, I did appreciate how intentionally it echoed and contrasted her interaction with Theon back in season 4, and that it kind of humorously made her underdeveloped, one-noted personality sort of the very reason for her demise. And another downside to having such a densely populated show like this is when you bring characters back like Littlefinger, a character whose scheming has led to things as impactful as Jon Arryn's death, and really not do much more with him than have him manipulate the world's most manipulatable child and descending forces from the Eyrie to help Sansa at Winterfell. This scene ultimately doesn't do much more than remind us that that character sat out the first half of this season and is still kind of being underutilized. By contrast, though, the happenings in Meereen were much more exciting and really encouragingly layered this week. So whereas Robb and Arryn really offered no challenge to the master schemer Littlefinger, Missandei and Grey Worm were the perfect foils for Tyrion, giving the usually intellectually dominant character some refreshing pushback. The scenes also highlighted one of the upsides of spending so much time with characters apart before ever bringing them together. That being because we've spent so much time with them in their own separate worlds, we're able to see and understand and to a certain extent trust both of their perspectives. Grey Worm and Missandei know slavery, and Tyrion knows politics, manipulation, and war, which makes the path ahead all the more excitingly uncertain. Of course, we can't spend that kind of quality time with all of our characters, and that's why the drama on the Iron Islands continues to be just a little less riveting. Nonetheless, it has been nice to see more of Yara these last few episodes, and have her scene this week continue those sibling reunions, not to mention show again in Theon what a sincerely guilty and repentant person can look like on this show. Which of course did directly contrast the jumping straight back into their old vengeful ways, / never leaving their old vengeful ways, that we saw with Cersei and Margaery back in King's Landing. And though that third sibling reunion between Margaery and Loras didn't provide that much to write home about, it did, coupled with the High Sparrow's fantastic monologue, continue to highlight that even in a world as broken as Game of Thrones, no one can eternally outpace the consequences of their actions. Or as the High Sparrow himself said, beneath the incense and the perfume and the fine food that had already started to turn, I saw it with perfect clarity. I saw what my sins were. The gold I had, the wine I drank, the women I used, my ceaseless struggle to maintain my position. And the High Sparrow's epiphany that he had had all those years ago and the actions that had followed did so perfectly connect in a thematic way to what those three brothers were feeling in this week's episode. Just that feeling of being laid low and so ready to, if they hadn't already, throw in the towel. With Theon, Loras, and of course with Jon, there really was that feeling that they'd stopped playing the Game of Thrones. It wasn't any longer about ruling, conquering, or even making a new name for oneself. They just wanted the pain to stop. They wanted to, as Jon said, get warm. Which could be a cheeky reference to Dany and Jon one day teaming up. Either way though, her storyline did really intentionally contrast Jon's as she picked up the towel and really reclaimed her right to rule and to reign. And though I would argue that that scene did lack some of the power of her season 1, season 2, and season 5 finale moments, what I did very much enjoy about this scene was its intentional deviations from those past moments. Unlike those scenes, it wasn't about the dragons demonstrating Dany's power or stealing the thunder of her moment. It was just Dany. Dragon's blood coursing through her veins, demonstrating to those people that she was indeed worth following. Which I have to say is exactly what I thought the storyline needed to be worth our time. It had to be about Dany finding herself and proving within her own heart and mind that she had the power all by herself to rule and to reign. And though she has rallied people to herself time and again, only to, time and again, fumble as a leader, it is promising that this scene, which customarily would be a season closer for her character, happened in episode 4. And this week's Twitter question comes to us from Karen Keane, who asks, what do you think of this season of Game of Thrones now that David and DB have passed Martin's books? Well, thank you for the question, Karen, and it really is an interesting one right now because this show does seem to be, with all these characters' deaths and rendezvous, that they're sort of cleaning house in a way. David and DB really trying to figure out what kind of show they themselves can make. And to be quite frank, it is becoming a much simpler, less unpredictable, straightforward TV drama because of it. One that feels a bit like the 1 hour and 50-minute East of Eden film adaptation of the original 700-page John Steinbeck novel. And so even as this episode was, again, in my opinion, opinion, significantly better than last week's, there still remains on this season of Game of Thrones this underlying feeling of this show is now being written entirely by a pair of Hollywood writers. Guys who have read the book on characterization, plotting, and structure, and seen the stats on how to market to and maintain an audience. And that's not having more characters than you can count, much less name, much less have any real investment in. But like Paul Osborne's adaptation of East Eden, I don't hate the fact that this show is becoming simpler and just a little more streamlined, because if David and DB can't do service to all these characters, or in trying end up selling all of them short, then they shouldn't try. They should stick to what they know and do it the best they can. That's my opinion anyways. I would still love to know what you guys are thinking though. Is this season of Game of Thrones just a little bit different feeling than past seasons, or is it all the same to you? Definitely comment below and let me know. Also, I would love to continue to answer your guys' Twitter questions, so definitely hop on over to Twitter, hashtagging all of your questions the heartbeat, and I will do my very best to answer those right here on the show each week. Finally, please do subscribe. I'm going to continue to review films and television on this channel, and I would love for you to stay up to date on all of those things. But for now, I'm Chris Hartwell. This is The Heartbeat. Thank you for joining me.